Welcome to Pensions Committee. My name's Rabia Haddon, I'm the Governance Service Officer. If I can just open the meeting. Welcome everyone to the Physical Pensions Committee meeting taking place at the Town Hall following the end of the emergency arrangements and virtual meeting setup. All committee members are required to attend in person. Members who wish to participate in a non-decision making capacity are able to do so remotely. This meeting will be live streamed for public viewing and a record of the decisions will be taken to be published after the meeting. I would like to remind members who are physically present and also those who may be joining remotely of the following protocols. Only speak when invited to by the chair. If you wish to speak, please raise your hand and direct all communications via the chair. For those joining remotely, please ensure that your mics are muted when you are not speaking. If you're having any technical difficulties, please use the chat function in Google Meet to alert the meeting, or you can dial in. Please do not use the chat function for putting formal questions to the committee. Any persistent disruptive behaviour will result in removal from the meeting. Would now like to hand over to the Chair, Councillor.
Thank you very much, Rabia. Well, first of all, welcome to everybody, particularly our new members, and it's great to see you all. I think I should start off with some introductions generally so that members can know the officers and officers can know the new members. So if I start off with myself, I'm Councillor Rob Chapman, I am Chair of the Pensions Committee. Rabia has introduced herself, so I'll go over to Jonathan.
Evening everybody, Jonathan Molan-Smith, co-opted scheme member representative, and prior to working for Hackney, a pension fund manager in the city.
Patrick?
I'm Patrick Spence, councillor in Haggerston Ward and a new member of the Pensions Committee.
Councillor Nick Sherman, member for Hackney Ward, and chair of the audit. Very pleased to be.
Indeed.
We're very pleased to see these newcomers. I'm Michael Desmond, Speaker of the Council, Councillor Hackney Downs, former Vice Chair of this committee. Councillor Haddon. I have had a copy of an email from Councillor Hayhurst here asking if someone can send him the Google invite for tonight. So I don't know, it's just going to...
I'm here, Michael.
He's here, he's arrived.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, so thank you, Michael.
So I'm Cam Adams, Councillor for Oxis and Shoreditch, member.
Vice Chair. So Andrew? Sorry, I don't...
My name is Angela Walker. I'm a member of the Hackney Legal Services team.
Jackie Moran, Director of Financial Management.
Ian Williams, Acting Chief Executive and Section 151 Officer.
Excellent. So, and online we have Andrew Johnson.
Hi, I'm Andrew Johnston, investment consultant, investment advisor for the pension fund from Hyman Robertson.
Okay, did we hear that all right?
No, not very.
You're muted, Rob.
Shouldn't be. Ben Hayhurst. They can't hear me.
Rob, I'll just try again and see. Is this any clearer? Can you hear me speak more clearly now? Excellent. So I'll just repeat. Andrew Johnston, investment consultant for the pension fund from Hymans Robertson.
Yeah, I'm muted, Rabia.
We can hear you now, Rob.
Can you?
Yes.
It says I'm muted. Yeah. All right, okay. Great. It's confusing. Right, so Ben Hayhurst, sorry.
Yeah, Councillor Ben Hayhurst.
Gemma Sefton.
Hi, I'm Gemma Sefton from Hymans Robertson and the Fund Actuary.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Again. Karen McWilliam.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Karen McWilliam, the Benefits and Governance Advisors to the Hackney Pension Fund. I'm from Aon.
Yeah, Mario.
Hi, Mario here from ICT Support.
The man without which none of this would be able to happen. Thank you. Rabia's introduced ourselves. Simon Jones.
Yeah, good evening. Simon Jones, also from Hymans Robertson. I'm a responsible investment specialist.
Excellent. Okay, I think that's everyone.
Ian Campbell as well.
Just one more.
Oh, Ian Campbell, sorry, apologies.
Yes, Ian Campbell, investment consultant from Hymans Robertson.
Welcome, Ian. Okay, thank you. So, apologies for absence received from Councillor Billington and Councillor Mima, and lateness from Thank you. The members are, agenda item 2, member asked to note the terms of reference of the Pensions Committee for the municipal year 21-2, and also note that myself has been appointed chair and Councillor Adams vice chair. So can we note that? Then get this in the right order. Item 4, sorry, there's a slight order issue here. So item 4 we have to take next, which is declarations of interest. Do members have any interest that they wish to declare?
Before, my wife, she's a member of a pension committee, pensions, local government pensions.
She remember the scheme, yeah?
Sorry?
She remember the
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, do we catch that? Now, what's the situation with that? Is there a general sort of exemption about people who are members of the scheme, or should we? Because I mean, we don't. There are a number of us who will be here. Do you want to know who are and who aren't?
Done in the past, yeah.
He's nodding. What's that mean?
Yes, that's what we've done.
We do want to. You do want to know who it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm a member of the scheme as well.
Are you a pensioner, Chair?
Yes, I am.
You are an active pensioner.
I'm
Well
an
done,
active
sir.
pensioner.
Lovely too.
Does anyone else have a membership in the scheme that needs to be noted?
I'm a deferred status.
Deferred, okay. I think that's almost, we've got a collection there of everyone.
That's my wife. I'm not a member, but my wife.
Yeah, your wife is, yeah. We noted that.
Yeah. Chair,
my wife is as well, but not this scheme, but there are.
As we just covered this, can I just ask Michael Desmond what his status is, please?
Yeah, Tottenham Hotspurs. Yeah, I contacted the relevant body last year because I wasn't quite sure, and they said I wasn't a member, so I'm not a member.
All right. Oh, right.
I thought I probably was. Yeah. I've been on this council for many, many years.
Yeah. Oh, dear.
I have to pick one box or another, so I'm not a member. It's terrifying.
Okay.
Chair, I think I'm a member.
Ben Hayhurst as well. It'd be useful if we could find a more streamlined way to deal with this, just to perhaps record them somewhere and, yeah.
What we've done in other places, we'll do it once, and that's for the side council.
Okay.
Chair, in that case, I'm a deferred member as well, actually, yes, just for,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you, Margaret. So, right, we'll try and find a more streamlined way to deal with that in the future. Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other declarations of interest or anything? Take that as a no. Okay, so item 5 then, the training, and this is the beginning of our ECFD and the Stewardship Code introduction here. But that's also the start of a big piece of work that we'll be doing this year on basically a review and revamping of all our responsible investment policies, which follows on from discussions we had. For the benefit of the new members, discussions we had at the beginning of our investment strategy process, where we looked at our values and things like that, and then just in terms of updating policy and procedures, and a whole set of work which we're going to put in training this year, which will end up with a completely revamped and modernised set of policies, procedures, and ways of behaving on this. So, okay. Now, I think who's going to kick us off on this? Is item 5 we're beginning with.
Excuse me, Chair. Sorry, have we approved item 3, the minutes?
Oh no, we haven't. Do you want to approve the minutes? And sorry, is anyone? If I can go to, I obviously having gone to item 4, I then forgot to go back to item 3. Yeah, apologies. So the minutes of the previous meetings, I won't go through them page by page, but does anyone want to offer any corrections? Can we then approve them as a true record?
Approved.
Yeah, apologies for getting that out of order. I could tell that was going to happen. Back to item 5 then. So, who's going to kick this off then from Hymans? Or is it one of the officers going to start?
I shall kick off from Hyman, subject
Andrew.
to any introductory comments Jackie would like to make. Yes, so this item is very much a training element with regard to the Stewardship Code and TCFD, which is the Task Force for Financial Disclosures. And Simon is going to take us through that. As Simon said, he's our head of responsible investment. But really all I want to say is briefly, responsible investment is a very important area for the LGPS at this point, and over the past 12 to 18 months and very far beyond, the committee has been doing lots and lots of work in this area. Specifically, if we move to, I'm not sure, Ian, if you can share screen at this stage. Hopefully that then will come up on screen within the committee room and enable us to sort of toggle through the presentation. So specifically on page 3, I thought it would be useful just to very briefly at this introductory stage recap on what has been done so far, what is being discussed today, and what will come in the future. So around 12 to 18 months ago, the committee have discussed and agreed updated investment beliefs for the fund. In addition to that, we had a training session with Karen Shackleton on sustainable development goals and established some high-level principles which were carried forward into the investment strategy review. The investment strategy review then took place over the coming meetings, and very much the investment beliefs and sustainable development goals were factored into the strategy review. Today, we're going to look at 2 aspects. The first of those is on training on stewardship and TCFD, but not just training on stewardship and TCFD. We're actually going to do an initial stock take of where the fund is with regard to the stewardship code at this point in time, which really means we're almost not just doing the training, we're actually taking step 1 of potentially moving towards becoming a signatory to the stewardship code. The second element today is to do a bit of a stock take on the alignment of responsible investment engagement policies, so on and so forth, with regard to 2 key investment managers that the scheme has, and that being the LSIV, so the London CIV pooling entity, and also BlackRock, who are the designated passive manager which the fund uses. So that's the 2 key bits today. Moving forward over the next few months, we will be looking at reviewing the investment beliefs again, revisiting the sustainable development goal aspirations, drafting and extending the climate policy which exists for the fund, setting a responsible investment policy, looking at climate scenario testing and of the investment strategy and the implications of various net zero targets which may become the focus for the committee in the future. That could be targeting 2030, 2040, 2050, just as an illustration. Also considering how the fund can go about adhering to stewardship and TCFD reporting, which will be a really important area. So there's some really significant activity on this front, which you will see a lot more on within the next few months, as well as going through into towards the end of the year. But really, I just wanted to set the scene in terms of what we've done so far, what the focus is for today, and also what's on the horizon. And with that, I'll pass over to Simon to go through the training.
Unless there are any initial.
Okay, Simon.
Thanks, Chair. So if we maybe jump onto the next slide, please, Ian. And just to maybe give a bit of an introduction to both TCFD and the UK Stewardship Code, they are both reporting standards, if you like. We'll talk through them in a bit more detail, but they're both ways of demonstrating the practices that you are putting in place in respect of TCFD around how you're approaching and managing climate risk. And with the Stewardship Code, it's a broader standard that really looks to address how you're approaching responsible investment in across the entirety of the management of the fund's assets. Now, that said, there are certain, obviously, if there are reporting requirements, there are certain things that you need to do to be able to report under each of these standards, and that's really going to be the focus of the discussion over the next half hour or so. to set out some dates, the UK Stewardship Code, it's a voluntary code of practice. It was launched by the Financial Reporting Council about 15 months ago, and they've just taken in their first round of signatories. So those who wanted to become a signatory this year had to get a report in by the 31st of March, 31st of April, or 30th of April if you're an asset owner. And the expectation is that entities will be able to report at different intervals that suits them, and they will, assuming their report is accepted by the FRC, become a signatory. So, for example, the date there is, if you want to become a signatory next year, we're probably looking to submit a report by the end of April 2022. But we can come back to that. The TCFD reporting requirements. Now, there isn't a formal reporting requirement that applies to the LGPS on this as yet. There is for the private sector. The government published final regulations last week, but it's very much anticipated that MHCLG is going to publish a consultation in the next short while. And really what we anticipate is that the requirements that apply to LGPS funds are going to be pretty similar to those that have just been put in place for private sector funds. To be honest, there's no reason they shouldn't be. We're fundamentally talking about the same thing. So when I'm talking about what is going to be expected under TCFD, I'm talking about the requirements as they've been put in place for private sector pension funds, on the assumption that there's going to be a pretty, probably about a 95% overlap with what's going to be required for LGPS. If I was a betting man, I would say that requirement is probably going to come into force probably from reporting in 2023, but maybe obligations to start in 2022. So that's the sort of timing we're thinking about there. So that's just by way of what is coming.
Simon, Jonathan wanted to put a point here. So
please, please ask.
Sorry to interrupt, Simon. Jonathan Maidensmith, scheme member, representative. I know acronyms and jargon are used in this world extensively, but for the benefit of new members of the committee, I think it would be important to actually explain what, for instance, FRC means. Please. Okay.
Of course. So FRC was the Financial Reporting Council, so it's one of the regulatory bodies in the UK. TCFD is an acronym I'll come on and talk about in a lot more detail shortly. So my apologies for that, Jonathan. If I slip into acronyms, please pull me up on it as we go through this. So if we can jump forward a couple of slides, Ian, and just talk about the TCFD recommendations. So TCFD stands for Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It was a group that was set up by Mark Carney back in 2015 and set out some recommendations in 2017. The goal of TCFD is to improve the disclosure of how entities are understanding and managing climate risk within their business, and that business might be for a corporate, or as an asset owner, it might be within the assets and liabilities of the plan. So, it has a broad application. Its framework has been well set out and been used for a number of years. At present, it's largely a voluntary initiative, although entities are starting to, or sort of regulators are starting to make it a mandatory reporting requirement, as the UK government has just done for pension funds, as I've spoken about. The structure of the reporting requirement covers 4 tiers, and they're illustrated there. So we'll talk through these in a bit more detail, but very briefly. Governance, so how you organize yourself to manage climate-related risks and who you delegate some of those responsibilities to. Your approach to strategy, so how you're understanding the impacts of climate risks and opportunities on the business and how you're setting a strategy to deal with them. Risk management, so how you're thinking in detail about the different sorts of risks that climate change may bring. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And then finally, metrics and targets. So how you will actually measure your exposure to climate risk and the targets that you might set. Andrew in his introduction mentioned ideas around net zero. So we know the UK government has set a target of having net zero carbon emissions by 2050 and laid that out in law. Pension funds are starting to make similar sorts of commitments, and that, if you take it back, and we'll talk about it in a bit more detail, I'm sure, as we progress this topic, implies the setting of targets. How are you going to get there? How are you going to measure your progress against that sort of goal? So that's the broad framework, and those are the four aspects that organisations are being asked to disclose their activities against. But as with everything, when we're disclosing information, if we jump to the next slide, please, when we're disclosing something, actually that implies that we're undertaking different steps that allow us to make those disclosures. And really what we have here are the 11 principles that were really reflected in the the DWP's regulations, as I've mentioned already, and the sorts of things that pension funds are being asked to do, and we would anticipate LGPS funds being asked to do, and consequently that you're then being asked to disclose against. So again, just to talk through these and expand on those four pillars in a little more detail, if I can. Again, I'll take them in turn. So. When we talk about governance, we're talking about the management structures that you have in place. So that might take several forms. So at the top level, it would be the committee's responsibility. So how is the committee exercising its function to understand and manage climate-related risk? To what extent are those responsibilities being delegated to others, be they asset managers, be they consultants, be they officers? So who is doing what in terms of trying to understand and manage climate risk? What does that governance structure look like? And that's that's something, that's a process that we're going to need to decide here. Whose job is it? Who's going to do what? And is there some sort of responsibility matrix that you're absolutely clear on who is doing what for you? And again, it's part of broader good governance of the fund. And I guess moving on, the second responsibility there is being able to then articulate what different persons or different organizations' responsibilities are. So, for example, if you're delegating certain aspects to the London CIV, how are you delegating? What are you delegating to them? How are you overseeing them? What are those responsibilities? And how are you going to ensure that they are doing the job that you've asked them to do? So, I mean, those are two aspects, quite fundamental to how the fund sets itself up to understand and manage climate-related risk, and to then be able to ensure that you're doing everything that you absolutely need to do. This is, it might come across a bit as box ticking, but this is more than box ticking. It's making sure that you have the structures in place. And probably important to say here that education is a critical part of this. Knowing what we're talking about and making sure that we've got training at the right times, this would count, is vital in that regard. Just moving on, strategy, and Andrew talked about investment strategy reviews a little while ago. Strategy we can think about is how are we reflecting the risks and opportunities that climate change actually might bring, and how are we ensuring that those risks are factored into our broader decision making? So, for example, when we're making or deciding on allocations to equities, do we think that different types of equity are going to deliver different levels of return, and are they reflected in the assumptions that we make? And that then comes into the third point there. So thinking about different climate-related scenarios, which you'll be asked to stress test the fund against and be able to report against. So, for example, if future policy changes, say we're heading for a 4-degree world, what impact is that likely to have on the fund's funding and investment strategy? Or if we if we enter a sort of a rapid policy shift, which we certainly hope we do, and we're targeting a less than 2 degrees of warming, what does that scenario look like? What are the implications for different asset class returns? What are the implications for interest rates, inflation, and the like? So how are assets and liabilities, how are they affected? So very much as part of the next valuation, that stress testing and the impacts on funding and investment strategy are things that you will be asked to consider, and then asked to report on. So that's sort of a part of the management process and a part of the strategy setting process. And it ultimately leads into decisions that you might take and say, well, okay, what sort of equities do we want to invest in? Do we want to invest in more resilient equities, for example, because they are likely to deliver us better outcomes? There's no questions. I'll just rattle through the next.
Are there any questions at this stage?
Yeah.
My question is just what's the difference between the TCFD and Stewart Code?
So TCFD is a framework for measuring or for understanding and reporting on climate-related risks specifically. So everything I'm talking about here sits within the TCFD framework. It's all talking about climate-related risks and your response to it. The Stewardship Code is a framework that is focused on your approach to responsible investment more generally. So it considers things beyond just climate change. It considers stewardship more generally. So how your asset managers might be voting on not just climate-related resolutions, but every resolution, whether they're taking other sort of risk factors into account. We'll come on to that in a little more detail in a moment, if that's okay.
Okay, do you want to press on, Simon?
Yeah, sure. So just to rattle through the next 2 columns. So risk management. How do we understand climate-related risks? And there are 2 sources of climate-related risks: the physical side, so the changes that have come from long-term changes to weather patterns. They're going to manifest over the medium to long term, but might be reflected in the value of assets in the short term. And transition risks. So as we change to a low carbon economy, which industries, which companies are going to be affected more, which are going to be affected less, and how does that manifest itself in terms of sort of the pricing of different assets? Fossil fuel companies are the obviously affected sector there, but not the only one. And depending on how fossil fuel companies react, it might be a positive or negative impact on valuation. So we got to identify the risks. We got to decide and determine how we're managing each of those risks, and it will vary from one asset class to the next. And then when we're disclosing it, we have to write down the processes that we have in place. A lot of that is going to be delegated to asset managers, but you need to be clear how you're assessing those asset managers and whether they are doing that job effectively, and how you are then assessing how well that job is being done. So those are the sorts of processes that we'll just need to be clear upon. And finally, there's the sort of the metrics and targets. Now, Hackney's already had one metric in place about reducing its carbon intensity. That was a 6-year ambition, I believe, and I think we're just coming to the end of the period over which you're setting that for. But what you're going to be asked to do is set potentially 3 different metrics. Some will be emissions related, so it might be total emissions, it might be weighted average emissions, just different ways of measuring exposure to carbon emissions. And again, we can get into that in a bit more detail in due course. And other ways of measuring exposure to climate related risks. So for example, you might look to measure how many companies are aligned with or what proportion of your portfolio is aligned with the Paris Agreement, for example. So the Paris Agreement being this sort of long-term commitment to get to keep warming under 2 degrees. So you need to set the targets, the metrics and the targets associated with those, and you're going to need to measure your performance against those. So that's going to be gathering information on carbon emissions and other aspects across the whole of the portfolio, and really sort of then disclosing, well, how far have we progressed against trying to achieve those particular targets. So again, different ways of setting those. It's a subject we could spend sort of several hours talking about. I'm not going to do it justice in a couple of minutes, but that's the final pillar of the governance and disclosure requirements around TCFD. Unless there's any questions on that, I'll just jump forward and say, well, look, what comes next?
Okay, well, we have got a question, Nick.
Yep.
Can I just
brilliant.
press you in along the metrics? I can see that these are outcome related. In other words, we want to see lower emissions, and the test of these metrics are the emissions going down. Are there any intermediate performance metrics that can show how the funds are tackling the process? I'm thinking one indicator is indicators that climate resolutions are or are not supported. BlackRock, for example, has been very slow in supporting them. Other funds have been more aggressive in this. So I'm not saying what's right or wrong, but more, have we got this sort of metrics that go that enable us to see the process as well as the outcomes?
Yeah, very, 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 very much so. So it's a really
we've got a
really
paper on alignment of the fund manager alignment with it later on, so we can pick BlackRock points up there. But so great. But example,
Yeah, no, it's a very good example, but yeah, generally there's a whole range of metrics that we could look at in terms of who's doing what and are they doing the things that we might expect. That idea of voting is absolutely one of them. Taking data from other sources to say, well, have companies got strategies in place to deal with climate risk would be another. And there's ways of measuring these things. And in terms of just next steps, talked already about the consultation that's coming. I think you have to work on the basis that this is going to come down the line for LGPS funds over the next year or so. So it makes absolute sense for you to be preparing for it now and dealing with climate risk. From a fiduciary responsibility, even if that reporting obligation hasn't been formalised. And given the broader agenda and the focus on responsible investment by the fund, what we do on climate risk overlaps very much with what we might do with regard to stewardship code reporting as well. And the tasks, and this will feed into the plan as Andrew's already outlined. Bit of an understanding where the gaps are to start with. But key tasks are going to be really looking at some of those processes. So how, getting into the detail, how we look at investment managers, for example, the scenario analysis, which I would suggest probably forms part of the next valuation, would be a sensible, an efficient way of doing that, and spending time just benchmarking the fund or getting an updated benchmark of the fund. That identification of those metrics and the setting of targets are going to be absolutely critical in terms of guiding this pathway, and all that's going to inform what you do, the steps you take, and the actions to manage climate risk within the fund. So that's really all I was going to say on TCFD. There is another slide that says, well, it doesn't matter where we are in the process. We can always look at this regardless of what we are doing at any given point in time. Responsible investment and climate change affects everything that we do. So regardless of where we are in the investment process, we need to be thinking about these things. And I'm sure it would be, but as part of any interrogation of advice, that question should be there. Have we considered climate change as part of this change? How does it impact the changes that we might be making? Are all sensible questions to be asking. That's really all I was going to say on TCFD. Unless there's any other questions, and I'll just spend a couple of minutes on stewardship code, but really then going to go into. Andrew's going to take us through just a bit of an update for the fund. So I'll, unless there's any questions on TCFD.
Chair, I had a question on
Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. That's really helpful. I suppose really then it's over to us if we want to be ahead of the game, irrespective of whether we are mandated to do this in the next 2 or 3 years, but both from a financial point of view and it being the right thing to do. Do we want to set ourselves sort of a target to come up with a complete strategy within the next 6 months? And is it down to us as the members of this committee to ultimately sort of set the metrics and targets with your advice as to what's achievable and right? And do we need to sort of schedule in a meeting or a training event to do that at some point in the near future?
Great question, Ben. Yeah, I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. So ultimately, it's the committee's role to sign off on any policy. I think, and I might be jumping on to Andrew's territory here, the planning is very much about probably to have some sort of workshop over the next couple of months just to go through a lot more of the detail around this, certainly to put probably figures against some of the metrics we might look at, and have that detailed plan of action that would take us forward over the next 6-9 months and say, right, here's our policy, here's the actions that we're going to take over the next 3 years, here's the targets that we've set, and here's how we're going to actually work to achieve those targets. Because setting targets is one thing, you've then got to take action to actually do something about them. Have you got anything to add, Andrew?
Okay,
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, so I would expect at the next meeting, which will potentially be almost an RI focused meeting, we will be looking at things like a draft responsible investment policy, a draft climate policy for discussion. Also, so in the strategy review that we did over the past 12 months, we did a component of scenario analysis on climate, but it wasn't the sort of front and center focus. We can refresh that and bring that into the conversation to look at those different, do that sort of scenario analysis. From a reporting standpoint, what we will do is we will look at potential avenues that can be explored from a reporting perspective to inform the metrics that we're gonna be focusing on. So, I think that was sort of my objective in terms of the scene setting piece. Is I think there's going to be a vast amount of information to kind of to take on board and discuss in the very near future.
Thank you, that's helpful. I don't know if one of our officers wants to comment, but we were discussing issuing a sort of timetable with a bit more detail of all the exercises that we need to do, and setting up dates for the various workshops we need, and dealing with all things like voting, engagement, collaborations, and things like that.
I think you're right, Chair. We need to issue a timetable of the actions we need to get to in order to get to the action plan, basically. So a series of workshops probably between now and the next pensions committee to move that on, because obviously the subject of the pensions committee is very much around the RI policy.
Okay. Right, so we'll be basically issuing on a more detailed plan before the next committee. So we know where we're going. Okay, is anybody else? Ben, you still got your hand up?
Only just to quickly say, with the metrics and targets, just a request, can that be a process where we're part of that as members and we'll walk through the different options and we have buy-in, rather than it sort of being presented as the end, as this is the most sensible option? So just so we understand what the different arguments are either way, and we have complete ownership of it, if that's possible.
My understanding is that absolutely that's the intention. But Andrew, I guess, or Simon?
No, absolutely agreed. Short answer.
Yeah, no. Yes, indeed.
So, I mean, obviously the new members won't have been involved in this discussion. If you remember, we agreed to have at least one workshop, probably two, over the course of this exercise. So go through this, in a sort of much more participative process than a formal committee sometimes allows. But obviously, people are very welcome to put their views and comments here. Okay, I can see hands on the system this time, so I don't see any. So if we can move on to the next bit, Simon.
Sure, yeah.
I can just say we've got a policy here that we break every hour have a 5-minute break every hour. So we've still got half an hour to go or so yet, but okay, off you go.
Okay, no, thanks, Chair. And I won't spend as long on this section because I think Andrew's going to pick up a bit of the detail in terms of the fund's positioning. But to introduce the UK Stewardship Code, I said the Stewardship Code has been around since 2012. It was originally set up as a basis for trying to encourage improved practices around stewardship by asset owners. Originally, it was quite equity focused, but the FRC, the Financial Reporting Council, went through an exercise 2018, 2019 to review, to refresh the code, launched it at the start of 2020, so hence the 2020 UK Stewardship Code. And so certainly in my view, it sets out, a market, an industry-leading framework for how funds can demonstrate their practices with regard to stewardship. It's probably sensible just to pick up that definition of what I mean by stewardship, which is written at the top of the slide, but the FRC defined it as the responsible allocation, management, and oversight of capital to create long-term value for clients and beneficiaries, leading to sustainable benefits for the economy, the environment, and society. So I guess a couple of things just to pick out from that. One, it's about how you allocate your assets, how you manage your assets, and how you how you exercise voting and engagement over those assets with the underlying companies and entities in which you invest. Second, it's very much focused on financial outcomes, but third, it also sees there being broader outcomes for other parts of the system. So, in referencing the environment, the society there as well, it recognises that we're interested in more than just financial returns. We're interested in sort of a company's broader footprint, for example. In terms of what you need to do to comply with the UK Stewardship Code, the FRC set out 12 principles for asset owners and asset managers. They're listed on this page and the next, and it's Ian who's going to talk through these in a little more detail shortly with regard to the fund's own positioning. So I'll not talk through the detail. But really what the FRC is looking for asset owners or organisations to do is say, okay, against each of these 12 principles, to understand why is this relevant to us. So, for example, let's just pick principle 4 there. So signatories identify, respond to market-wide systemic risks and promote well-functioning financial systems. So why does this matter to us? Why does this principle matter to us? Well, why does systemic risk matter to us? Climate change is a systemic risk. It matters to us because it could have a meaningful impact on our assets and liabilities. And as an asset owner, we can do something to start changing the systems. That's why it matters. In terms of then reporting, what you're being asked to do is to say, what have we done to try and address this principle? And what have we achieved as a consequence of doing this? So the FRC's reporting is very much focused on activities or actions and the outcomes of those actions. They, rather than just saying this is what we're doing, it's saying what you've done and what you've achieved as a consequence of what you're doing. So with regard to that principle 4 again, for example, it might be, well, we recognise climate risk is a systemic risk. We've put in place a whole climate policy to address this, and we've shifted 10% of our assets from here to there, and the outcome is that we've reduced the carbon emissions from our assets by 10%, just by way of example. And yes, you can expand on that, but that's the sort of outcome-oriented reporting that the FRC is looking at. So signing up to the Stewardship Code is sort of no small ask of asset owners. You are being asked to demonstrate how you are complying with what is market leading practice in going through this, but it's equally a way of demonstrating that to your peers, to others who might look to hold you accountable, this is important to us. Responsible investment and stewardship of assets generally is important to us. This framework matters, our actions matter, the outcomes of those actions matter, and we're prepared to stand here and be be asked questions to demonstrate how we're actually upholding the actions that we've said we're going to do, and judge us by our outcomes effectively. So that's really the purpose of the stewardship code. In terms of, so I talked a bit about timelines before. The first reports have been submitted in the last few months. So asset managers, investment consultants submitted by the end of March. We submitted our own report at the end of March. Other asset owners had an extra month to submit that. So we expect very much over the next couple of months for the FRC to come back and provide feedback to those who've submitted reports and to publish its first list of signatories. Anyone can then sort of look to sign up to this. The obligations on you are as laid out in the document. That's probably enough by way of the overview of what the stewardship code is trying to achieve. And unless there's any questions, I think it may be sensible just for Ian to talk a bit about, for each of these principles, where does the Hackney Fund currently sit? If that would be helpful.
Okay, Ian.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't see any questions. So,
Chair, I was going to quickly ask, any other local authorities up and down the country that submitted in the first round the stewardship code?
Certainly at least one of the pools did. I know the Brunel pool did. I don't know if the London CIV did. To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised.
Not yet.
So but I think some of the larger pension funds certainly did. So the answer to that is yes, some funds will have done. I don't know who they are. I've got one or two names that I would suggest, but I don't have a definitive list, I'm afraid.
Yeah, the civ is imminent, I think.
Yeah.
If someone wants to say that, yeah. Okay, yeah. So is Ian going to take the rest of us?
Yeah. Okay.
Campbell. I can see hands on the system this time. So if anyone wants to use this, who's attending virtually wants to use the hand thing, I will be able to see it. Okay.
Okay. So what we set out on this slide and the next two is a table with an assessment of how the fund is currently positioned against the requirements of each of the Code's 12 principles. So for each, we've set out a quick description of what the objective of each principle is and what it's trying to achieve, and then some assessment of how the fund's currently placed against it and what might be required to fully address it. And then for each, we've kind of given it a red, amber, green rating as well. So a green would mean that you're doing a lot of the work already and it won't take too much more to meet this principle. A yellow meaning maybe you're not doing a huge amount of the work yet, but it won't take too much to get there. And a red being you maybe not meeting the principle yet, and it's a big principle. It's going to require quite a bit of work to get there. So I'll just run through each one quickly, one by one. So principle one, it is to set out the purpose of the fund and its investments beliefs, to give an understanding of the strategy of the fund and its culture as well. The current status, we think currently a lot of the information that's required is within the fund's investment strategy statement, or ISS, and that's kept up to date. It's updated annually, and similarly, as we've set out, we've got a wide range of responsible investment work planned and to set RI beliefs and a policy for the fund. So a lot of this work's already there, or it's in process, so we don't expect this to be a huge amount of work to meet this one. So happily this is a green at the minute. The second principle is regarding internal governance structure of the fund and its resources. So really you need to identify the governance structures and resources that are in place. So here we believe everything required already exists. You've already got governance structure documentation, list of the personnel and training. That's in place, and so really it's just going to be an exercise of kind of collating this in order for the submission. So you've got another green there. We're coming to a couple of ambers now. So principle 3 is the management of conflicts of interest. where really you have to detail how any actual or potential conflicts of interest are handled. So here we will need to contact the managers and also London Civ about their policies, and we'll have to kind of collate these as well. And just to say that we're going to be hearing that a lot throughout this. We're going to be relying on the investment managers and London Civ to provide a lot of information for our submission. So we're going to be heavily reliant on them. Did I see a hands raised there? No.
I can't see one. Sorry.
Okay. Fine. So fourth principle is identification and monitoring of systemic risks, the one that Simon just mentioned here. So you really have to set out the detail of the role that the fund plays in industry initiatives in the improvement of the financial system. So here again, we'll be contacting the managers and the London Civ to see about any involvement they have in this area, what they do. But similarly, the fund itself also does things in this area, so we can talk about its own risk management policies and risk controls and things like rebalancing that it uses to help manage risks here. This slide doesn't look as happy as the previous one. There's a bit of red on here. So again, I'll go through each one by one. So principle 5 is essentially the review of the effectiveness of the fund's policies. So here we need to review how effectively we've implemented the fund's policies and also how effective they've been at achieving what they were set out to do. So again, this is going to have to be heavily discussed with the fund's managers on how they can provide reporting to provide kind of specific examples of how they have implemented our own policies to address this here. Principle 6 is communication of stewardship approach to the beneficiaries of the fund. So really we need to communicate why the stewardship activities adopted are in place, why they're appropriate as well. So a lot of this...
Excuse me, and Jonathan wants to interject.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks, Chair. I'm interested in P6, communication of stewardship approach to beneficiaries. We're talking about a defined benefit scheme here, which of course, as far as the beneficiaries are concerned, that is legally formulaically based. So what is the purpose of communicating about stewardship to beneficiaries of a defined benefit scheme? Why are they bothered, is my question.
I'm tempted to say ask the judge, but perhaps would Ian, Simon, or Andrew want to come back on that?
I would say, Jonathan, it's to do with, I guess it's effective governance to include communication on how the committee are overseeing the investment strategy that is there. Because ultimately, I guess the committee is there to invest for the benefit of the members, if you like. So therefore, in member communications, the objective of representing the stewardship approach of the committee is to demonstrate how the metrics, the approach that is being taken by the committee. So I think it's probably more of a good governance point to actually just include stewardship in communication, as opposed to, let's say, focusing on, let's say, other aspects.
If I can add to that, is although local government pension schemes are, it's not trust based. You are not trustees. You are effectively trustees in my mind. So in effect, you're investing assets for the benefit of those members. You're acting in their interests. So if I'm sat on the beneficiary as a beneficiary, yes, I'm interested and I'm going to get my pension at the end of the day. So, as an informed member, I'm interested in all aspects of how the assets of my pension fund are being invested, not just the sort of the funding level. It might be the key metric you look at, but I'm interested in more than just that. And I think you're absolutely right. There will be some who aren't interested, but there will be others who clearly are. So if you're representing them, I think you need to be accountable to them, and part of that accountability is through reporting.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a very important question, actually, isn't it? I'm aware of the recent legal considerations on that, where basically the judgment on the ministerial boycotting case, where the opinion was very clearly that we represent the interests of the members of the fund, and although effectively the authority has to meet any deficit, legally they were very clear that it is the fund members who we're responsible to, in my reading anyway. Okay, so back to Ian, is it, or unless anyone's got any further comments?
Just while we're on these,
Nick, yeah.
I'm a bit surprising that there's a lot to do on reviewing the effectiveness. That, to me, sounds like something we should be doing anyway, and that's merely a question of putting it in order for the code. Have I got that wrong in some way?
Andrew, Ian?
I think I guess the communication with the managers does take place at this stage. It's just perhaps the actual composition of that communication which needs to be evolved, and the representation of the communication which needs a lot of work. So perhaps to me the red here doesn't represent the fact that there isn't a good structure in place at the minute. I don't believe that's the case. I think the red here represents actually it's going to be quite onerous to demonstrate and pull together the required information in order to sort of adhere to the stewardship code requirements. I think that would be my take on it.
I think we all agree. I mean, we're trying to up our game all round here, on this. And while that doesn't necessarily point to any inadequacy of the way we looked at it so far, just the standards are much higher now than they were. When we last did all this.
I think it's formalising, and formalising, developing, and delivering on the framework that's in place for the stewardship code. And I think the red here really represents the fact that we need to formulate a review procedure, create a work plan that will enable the fund to regularly review all of the policies and so on and so forth. So it's that actual formalisation, and there will be bits that there might be gaps in, or they might not happen on an annual basis like they now have to. But I do think that most of the work's been done. It's just the fact that it needs to be really much more robust, formal, and process oriented, if you like.
Okay. So Ian, if you want to press on.
Sure. Okay. So principle 7 is the integration of your ESG or RI policies when appointing your investment managers. So you need to make sure that your RI policies are being integrated into when you select a manager and award them some assets to manage, but also monitor them on an ongoing basis. So we do this at the moment, for example, in our recent due diligence of the recent London Civ funds that we've allocated to. We have included responsible investment as a key input, and the underlying managers and the London Civs policies on here. However, again, as we were just discussing, there's going to be a little bit of work here to be able to evidence this, to show that we are doing this here. Principle 8 is around monitoring and really holding your managers and your service providers to account on your responsible investment policies. So confirming that their assets that are running for you are in line with your responsible investment policy. So we've discussed that we're going to be going and resetting a responsible investment policy later this year, and this will of course be a key input into this work. But then there'll be a big bit of work needing to kind of set up a regular and formal way of monitoring the managers against this and ensuring that they are implementing your RI policy. So again, this will need to be discussed quite a lot with the investment in managers here. Okay, slightly happier looking slide again. One more red and then it's a bit more positive for us. So policy 9 is around engagement with issuers. So this is issuers of the stocks and shares that you're investing in. So here, any signatories of the code need to show that they are engaging with companies on particular issues. So here we need to make sure we're providing the details of the manager engagements and also the outcomes. This is kind of a big task for everyone, which is why it's in red. We can get huge amounts of data here on kind of voting and engagement, and so this again will need to be collated for submission. So again, it's going to be a big task discussing with the managers how we set up a template for them to provide this information to us.
Just to add one point here is, I think on something like this, particularly as more of your assets are managed through the London CIV, is where you can perhaps lean harder on them. So if part of their policy and their own disclosures are, well, look, this is how we approach engagement, that might be might be something that you can perhaps cross-refer to their disclosures, or use examples from their disclosures, and actually refer to your own engagement with the London CIV. And just to pick up Ben's question there, I guess an issuer is ultimately a sort of an entity, so someone who would issue equity or issue debt, so a company, for example, and a manager would look after a portfolio of company shares or bonds, just to draw that distinction. Sorry, Ian.
Okay, no, that's great. Thank you, Simon.
Just because again, we could also look at collaborations with other organisations. I mean, we're already members of LATF, and possibility of other organisations working in similar sorts of fields like the IIGC and PRI and things like that.
Exactly, and that is Principle 10, collaborative engagement. So.
I've led into you there nicely. There, go on.
Thank you very much. So yeah, this is looking at both kind of how the fund directly collaborates with others, so through LAP, through London Civ, but also indirectly with how the managers are collaborating with your assets on your behalf as well. So again, it's about getting this information from the managers, but also being able to provide it yourselves with LAP engagements and collaboration.
I'm glad you see that as green. I'm glad you see that as green, but I think there's more we could do
there. On Principle 11, so escalation policy towards issuers. So again, this is the underlying company. So when we're engaging with them, if we don't get a response, how do we decide to escalate this? And we need to set out a policy for this. So currently we don't have a formal policy agreed. So currently we'll be looking to London Civ, looking to the managers, our engagement providers to find out what they're doing, but also have a view about what we want to do in this space, how we want to make sure that any engagement is escalated if there is a lack of response from the issuers on this. And then finally, Principle 12, exercising of rights, including a voting policy. So here, all signatories must exercise your rights on the securities you hold with your voting rights across all geographies. And again, this information is there, so the London Civ and your underlying managers and your engagement providers are voting these stocks on your behalf. They have this information there readily available. It's just there's a huge amount of information, and it's getting it together, collating it into a form that can be submitted for approval for the stewardship code. So that's all we had on the assessment of the fund against the requirements of the stewardship code. Bit of a mixed picture. Some policies or principles requiring a bit more work than others, but not a million miles away, I think we can see.
Okay, Karen McWilliam wants to come in with a comment. Karen.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Just a couple of points. First of all, going back to Councillor Hayhurst's question about any other LGPS funds, One that I am aware of that is submitted in the first round of the stewardship code is the Environment Agency Pension Fund, and you can actually find their submission on their website. So that might be quite an interesting read if members were interested in how another LGPS fund has approached this. And the second point is just following up on Jonathan's questions about communication and engagement with the scheme stakeholders and their schemes members. I completely agree that it's really important that we do communicate with the scheme members of the fund. I suppose even though it may feel it's a low amount of resource requirement, which was what was on the RAG status here, I think we can't underestimate how important it will be to get that communication right, because guaranteed there will be someone who doesn't like the answer, and there will be some scheme members that think we're not going far enough, and there's others just won't be able to understand what we're talking about. So even though it maybe won't be a lot of work to do that, it will need to be very carefully thought through about how and what we say in those communications. So I just want to highlight that risk.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, are there any other questions or comments?
Can I just
Cam?
Yes, I'm just wondering if one signs up to this stewardship code, and at some point they are unable to meet up with the condition, what are the consequences of that?
So I'll take that one if I can, Chair. So the reporting requirement in the stewardship code is an annual obligation. So you need to demonstrate what you're doing each year. It's not a once and for all type disclosure. I think if you fall short on one of the obligations during the course of the year, you explain what you've tried to do and you explain what the outcome has been. And if you've not achieved what you set out to do, you explain why that's been achieved. I would not suspect you'll get penalised for that if you're open and transparent about this thing. And I think one of the things that underpins a lot of activity around stewardship is transparency. And as Karen said, that clarity of communication as well. So say what you've done, say why it's been successful or not, and organisation. We talked a bit about engagement through here. There's a lot of engagement goes on. It's not always successful. A lot of time, asset managers, when they talk to companies, don't achieve what they set out to do. But if that's the case, we say what we've done and say what we're going to try and do to do it better next year.
Okay, Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair. It's a question about the FRC. I'm being told that the FRC will evaluate reports and that the report is approved by the FRC. My question is, how well resourced and experienced are the people within the FRC to be able to evaluate all these reports?
Really good question. So the FRC have already had a trial run at this, in that they asked, or they took a number of early disclosures that companies, primarily asset managers, submitted last year, and evaluated them, published a fairly detailed report on the successes, or what they saw as good, what they saw as bad within them. So I think they have a fair amount of experience of actually looking at these things, and given they went through a fairly extensive exercise in terms of writing the code, of consulting with industry on the code, I think they have a pretty good idea of what they're looking for and what they think good or bad actually looks like. With regard to resource, I honestly don't know the answer to that. I'm afraid. I believe they were adding to sort of resource because there was a lot of potential signatories, but I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, I'm afraid.
Okay, Simon, if I could direct you, can you see the chat? And there's a couple of questions raised by Councillor Hayhurst on the chat. I'm not sure. Can everyone see? I better read them out then, hadn't I? So how does the issuer differ from manager as one? And how are you going to progress out our stewardship code, and in what timescales? Is it the same as TCFD?
So the first one, sorry, the first question, I think, in terms of issuer and manager, I think Simon touched on as we went through, hopefully. In terms of the progressing the stewardship code and in what timescales, same as TCFD, I think that's the indication we have from the committee is that there is a desire and aspiration to sort of sign up to the signatory code. Therefore, we'll kind of take forward the initial sort of red, amber, green that we've put in place here. We'll discuss it with the officers and sort of build towards the sort of deadline of April 22. So I think there'll be probably a lot of work between now and then, and we'll report back to the committee as we sort of move through that.
Okay, and as I said at the beginning, we're intending to circulate a bit more of a detailed programme and timetable, including dates for the future meetings that we need to consider the issues. So you should give that information before the next committee meeting. Okay, then, is there any more questions or comments on that item? Hang on, get the right bit. People, I don't see any. God, that's right. So, okay, so thank you all very much. Obviously, it's a really important piece of work, which is going to be, obviously, as we said earlier, the main focus of what we'll be doing over the next few months. And as you know, there's a lot of interest and comments outside the membership and within the membership and in the committee itself. And so it's an area under a lot of public focus. It's also, I think, very, very important that we are responsible managers on behalf of our pension fund of the assets that we're in control of. And I think, all this is a very useful and helpful way forward in achieving those ambitions and bringing ourselves up to date, really, isn't it? So, okay, unless there's any comments or last questions on that, thank you all very much for the presentation from Hymans. That's really helpful. We'll have a little break now for 5 minutes. So, back here, we're just in 5 minutes. That's what, 18 minutes 12 minutes to 8. Yeah, my watch is right. I'll wait for you all to get back. Anyway, okay, so thank you. Okay. Yeah, if we can start again. So yeah, we move on. We're a little behind on our timetable. So later points, and although the stuff we've been dealing with is very important and goes to the core of what we'll be looking at for the future, we might need to skim through some of the items later on the agenda. I apologise for that. Can I also remind members of people present remotely not to use the chat function? It's quite well, as we've been previously advised. Apart from anything else, not everyone here can see it. So if you should refrain from using the chat function, please. Okay. So I think item 6. I think Jackie Moylan's going to say a few words to start. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Item 6 is very much linked to the last item. So the committee previously asked that we did an analysis of how some of our major fund managers' investment policies align with our own, and Andrew from Hymans is going to give us a quick update on how they aligned in relation to LSIV and BlackRock.
Okay. Andrew, is it?
Yes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Jackie. So as Jackie says, in the pooling environment, LSIV and BlackRock are really key. Have a key role to play for the fund. I think following the strategic review, once all the changes have been made, LSIV and BlackRock will oversee, if you like, circa 70% of the fund's assets, and that is over time only anticipated to grow. Hence the focus on these two key relationships, and I guess the array of investment beliefs, responsible investment beliefs, climate and voting policies, culture, signature, what they sign up to, how the mandates are designed, reporting, why that's so important for the fund. So the objective of this document is perhaps just to do an initial stock take on where there is good alignment and perhaps just to understand the mechanics of their business. And I think I don't plan on going through every page in this document. I'm going to try and highlight a few key points. I think probably the bits that almost my high level overview would be, I think that LSIV demonstrates to me a really strong and thorough approach to responsible investment, which is a work in progress. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of things that are.
We've said LSIV before, and I've been guilty of this as well, haven't we? But just you ought to say what it is.
So London CIV, London Collective Investment Vehicle, is the pooling entity which has been established to create funds for London boroughs to invest in. So essentially, the 40 or 50 billion of assets that is in London boroughs are intended to be sort of invested via LSIV or BlackRock as the passive entity in the main. And I think that's a journey that began circa 4 or 5 years ago, and it's a journey that's got a few more years to go. But we're as a fund, Hackney are fully committed to utilising London CIV, London Collective Investment Vehicles, for the purposes of their investment strategy. So hence that, hopefully that helps, Chair.
Would it be helpful to put some numbers around those?
Yeah.
Out of the total investment fund, what proportion goes to each of those, and what's the trajectory?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay.
We have that document, don't we? We had it on the last committee agenda, but we could. Oh, sorry, Jackie.
I'll say that is on one of the later papers, actually on the appendix to the quarterly report. There's a breakdown of the different holdings and percentages, etc.
Oh yes, because we see it again in the quarterly report paper. Yeah. Okay, so we pick up again there.
Okay. So as I say, I think that what the summary that we have here goes through a lot of key areas that are relevant for the fund, and it to me demonstrates that the London CIV's really on is working towards, having a climate aspiration in terms of saying that out later this year, developing responsible investment policies, climate policies, voting arrangements that are very much a work in progress, and they've made massive strides on that in recent times. And there is a strong alignment, I believe, in terms of how they actually take take on board other London boroughs and actually try and then take those forward and build investment vehicles that are suitable for delivering on those objectives. BlackRock is a slightly different beast, if you like, because BlackRock has got lots of other key stakeholders that they invest on behalf of, and therefore they've got lots more considerations to take on board. And I think equally BlackRock have, because they've got more assets, so in theory from a responsible investment standpoint, they've got a bigger voice. And I think they've been, over the last few years, getting to grips with the strength of that voice and working out how they can actually maximise the use of that. And I think they too have made very positive strides in the past 18, 24 months with regard to the sort of use of the scale of assets that they have on board and how they actually utilise that strong position that they find themselves in. So perhaps just stepping through a few highlights in the report. On page 4, we touch on investment beliefs, and for new committee members, it would be really useful. This is a really useful guide on the left-hand side to reflect on what the pension fund's investment beliefs are as they stand at this point in time, and that's something that we will be revisiting as we move through the coming months. But that should give you a flavour for the sort of fund-specific portfolio management beliefs and ESG beliefs that have been discussed and agreed by this committee in the past and are as they stand at this point in time. For London CIV, you can see that responsible investment is referenced within their investment beliefs very explicitly, and responsible investment mitigates financial risks and maximises opportunity. And also there is a strong alignment with regard to things like costs and management, fund structuring, implementation costs, and so on and so forth, and how those should be managed. As I say, for BlackRock, it's a bit more challenging to be specifically aligned to the pension fund, given their broad and diverse investor base. On RI policies, as Simon alluded to earlier, the Hackney Pension Fund at this stage is at the end of the sort of 6-year journey, if you like, in relation to making a commitment to reduce the carbon exposure by 50% over the coming 2 valuations. And in addition, we've done work on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are a very good standard for sustainable investing, as sort of represented in the LDPS. They also look at individual pension funds within the London boroughs to try and establish their own core investment beliefs. And they do have an array of ESG matters which are considered when it comes to designing manager mandates, but also holding managers to account in areas such as human rights, so on and so forth, and corporate governance. BlackRock have got a range of factors that believe.
Sorry, Andrew, can I just, Margaret Goldman wanted to make a comment. Margaret?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Sorry, it took so long to call you there.
Yes, thanks very much, Chair. I don't know whether this is the right point to ask this, but I just really wanted to ask about our relationships with these 2 investment managers. Are we tied in with them for a sort of period of time? And what is the sort of dynamic in terms of us as a pension fund influencing the future direction of their more general investment policies? Thank you.
Sure. So I'll maybe do the first part of that, and Chair, you may wish to extend. So the passive investment management is a way of gaining low-cost exposure to various investment allocations. And London CIV, as an organisation formed and I guess owned to an extent by the London boroughs, identified competitive fee rates for 2 passive managers who are Legal & General and BlackRock. So essentially, BlackRock are there to provide low-cost exposure to the designated asset classes selected by the committee. So they are almost a passive manager of choice, but the actual vehicles that we're in are very much flexible and up to the decisions and choices of the committee. Similarly, London CIV are essentially, I guess to an extent, we're not quite a shareholder, but the fund is one of the founding members, if you like, of the London collective investment vehicle, and therefore I think the expectation would be that the I guess the journeys that both are on are aligned, and therefore London CIB will very much listen to the views and aspirations of the pension fund and design solutions which will meet the investment aspirations of the pension fund. And Chair, I don't know if you want to add anything more with regard to the relationship between the fund and London CIB.
Yeah, it's still Ian may want to come in as well, but Ian Williams. Yeah, it's still working really. I think it's fair to say the CIV got off to quite a difficult start, but nowadays with the chief executive was appointed in March, March 19 now, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, going back like there's been much improvement and a much better relationship. And members of the committee at that time will remember we had a discussion about it, which resulted in myself writing to with another chair in London to the chief executive of the CIV when they'd just been appointed, and given the whole list of issues on responsible investment where we felt that previously their efforts have been completely inadequate. And they've taken on board all of that, and they've now got a whole programme where I think they're very rapidly moving to being one of the leading pools in the country in this area with a responsible investment team working full-time on all these issues and pushing forward this agenda that we're talking about tonight very rapidly. I think it's still an issue to work out who is responsible for what within the CIV, between the CIV and the authorities in a way, because what the legal responsibility for responsible investment lies with us, without a doubt, but in effect, we can only really do it through the CIV. So the discussions and all of that will continue. But we have a very good relationship with them at the moment. And while it's still problematic in some ways, I think there's an awful lot of work been done, and I think there's a lot in there that's now good. I don't know if Ian wants to add anything, because you've been involved in it since the beginning as well, haven't you?
I think that's a very fair summary, Chair, if I'm honest. What I would say is, and it's important for particularly new members of the committee to recognise is that this committee sets the strategic direction and sets the asset allocation strategy, but ultimately it's by the CIV that they choose the particular fund managers, and that's how the concept is constructed. So I think it's just important to bear that in mind, and I'm very happy for new members of the committee to run a particular session on the distinctive, if you like, division of responsibilities between the CIV and the pension committee, if that's helpful.
It's one of the items to note in section 12 if we ever get there. Okay then, so is that all right, Margaret? Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, should we proceed? Ben, that is it?
Yeah, I just had
oh yeah, you got your hand up, I see that, sorry.
No, sorry, a follow on from Margaret, and also just dovetailing with what Ian was just saying, and the sort of the red rating for the effectiveness on the stewardship. So this relates to obviously emails that a lot of us have had over the last few weeks and months. I just want to take sort of a hypothetical example. So say that we have made, via the CIV, we've invested in a certain amount of equities, which is, say, managed by BlackRock, for example, and in a fund whereby there's maybe 2,000, they hold 2,000 different shareholdings at any one point. Say one of those companies is a arms manufacturer, and they they're found out to have manufactured something that is highly lethal. It's caused an awful amount of say damage in a war zone, a lot of collateral civilian damage, and their share price might be going down as a result of that, but also other obligations. We feel we no longer want to invest in that, say, that one of those 2,000 other. We're happy with the other 1,999, but that one particular company, and we want to withdraw our shareholding from that, but it's via the CIV. Do we have a mechanism to do that? Do we have to wait to the expiry of the our mandate with the CIV? How exactly? What are the issues about around that scenario? Because this is what we're often being asked about, and I'm not yet really informed to sort of answer on the practicalities of it.
Yeah, that's a very real issue. I don't know if one of our officers wants to come in first. Or...
I think what you're asking there, Councillor Hayes, is around approaches to exclusions.
Yeah.
And the reality is, and we've debated it many times at this committee, that we don't do exclusionary policy. I don't know, Andrew, as one of our advisors, if you want to just come in there and explain some of the challenges that would exist if you were to go down that route.
Yeah, and perhaps there are two key ways that you can choose to invest, say, in equities, and that is active and passive. Passive investments means you select from a strategic decision-making point of view, you select an index, and therefore you as a committee have decided to hold the constituents of that index. So therefore, it's not, I guess it's not practical to then challenge the manager to remove them from that index because they are a constituent part of that index. So that's probably relevant for the BlackRock consideration. So the selection of the index is the committee's choice. When it comes to active investment, if let's say that an active investment manager holds a stock such as what you mentioned, Ben, you could go to LSIV and almost say, "This has happened. What are you doing about it?" And get LSIV on your behalf to challenge the manager as to whether or not they really do want to continue to hold that asset, or demonstrate a clear path as to the investment rationale, plus the responsible investment rationale for holding on to that asset. So there's kind of two different considerations from active and passive. When it comes to exclusion, I think the decision at this stage that the committee have made is not to go down an exclusionary route, and that's because I guess there isn't sufficient grounds for let's say that being definitively in the best interest of the members. And I think that exclusionary consideration is something that it may be revisited, but I think that at the moment, for the time being, that's kind of the approach that has been discussed and agreed by the committee.
And what would be so in one sense, going down an active approach, the downside is it may cost more, and upside is you have greater control, and that might further our ability to meet, say, the effectiveness on the stewardship code and other things. I'm just trying to understand the different arguments. But on the exclusion basis, but say just hypothetically, you could point to another stock that was performing better than X company you wanted to exclude. Why is that? What is the financial detriment on that analysis?
Simon, I don't know if you want to come in on that one, and just whenever it comes to the broad exclusion side of things.
I think it comes down to the way in which the asset manager is mandated. So I guess if you ask BlackRock to say, we want you to deliver us performance in line with the FTSE 100 index, so the top 100 companies in the UK, the simplest way of them delivering that is to buy those 100 companies in proportion to their weights in the index, and that's the fundamental principle of index investing. I mean, I take your point. You could go along to them and say, "Oh, we don't like that because that company has done X." Someone else might come along to them and say, "Well, we don't like company Y because they've done something," and so on. There's a point at which it becomes impractical for an asset manager to take into account everyone's wishes because they are acting in the collective interests of a group of investors, and you are investing in funds, so that control is something that is ceded. The way in which you can start approaching this through passive-like investment is at the mandate design stage. So I guess one of the evolutions of passive fund management is looking at different sorts of indices and different sorts of fund structures where certain levels of exclusion are built in as a standard. So, for example, you might have a fund that excludes, as a matter of design, companies that mine or produce energy from thermal coal. And that is written into the mandate, and you know that the manager won't hold any of those stocks because it's written into the basis on which they will they will construct the index, and they will do something compensatory to take account of that. So that becomes a choice for the committee, is say, well, what fund do we want to invest in? Which index do we want to track? What are the exclusions attached to those mandates? And that's a way of starting to move in that direction. But unless you choose to be active, or unless you have your own separate account, you can't then go and apply that exclusionary criteria. Just by virtue of practicalities.
So really, it's either we either need to have active mandates to really have the real clout, and then that's an argument as to what extra that costs vis-a-vis the benefits.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, that's sort of one of the considerations, certainly.
We're not going to crack this one tonight, although there's lots of issues. So there's lots of people want to now contribute. So I'll go to Patrick first, and then Margaret. Patrick.
I was just going to point out on page 49 of the bundle, the heading "Voting and Engagement" in the middle column, LCIB, and the penultimate paragraph there does give an example there, doesn't it, of what we've just been told about, which is this notion of you write it into the mandate that we include certain items, and it gives the example of a particular fund, the LCIB Sustainable Equity Exclusion Fund. That's its title.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm assuming there may be other examples within LCIB, likewise, where there are exclusions built into the mandate.
Yeah,
it'd be interesting to know.
There are possibilities in all of that, and and as Andrew was saying about choices of index. Margaret, sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I think it's probably been answered. It's a similar point to Patrick's, really, about what the possibilities are with the LSIF as a whole, really, to explore these sort of investments, and also really the sort of parallels between the work that's been done in relation to climate change, because I mean, obviously that must have an element of exclusion to it, unless I've misunderstood. Thank you.
Yeah, and perhaps just in terms of the equities that the fund holds, there are three main mandates, three main global mandates, which have been chosen by the committee, which will be held once a transition takes place over the summer, and they are the London CIV Sustainable Equity Fund, not the exclusion version. Just to refer to you, so it's the Sustainable Equity Fund. It's the London CIV Baillie Gifford Paris Aligned Fund, which is a benchmark which incorporates the Paris considerations, and then the BlackRock Low Carbon Mandate. So the actual investments which the committee have decided upon do not at this stage have an exclusion policy, but they do have very much a consideration of the aspirations with regard to climate and so on and so forth.
Which is actually exactly what West Sussex have done. But yes, so I think it's fair to say that in terms of responsible investment, I mean, the decisions the committee have already made in the investment strategy will take us into a range of investments are friendlier to responsible investment. So whether however, this is a very important issue, and obviously of current concern, but we're not going to crack it immediately tonight, and obviously one of the reasons that we're looking at our responsible investment policies is to explore all this further and see how we might better carry out our functions, taking all these issues into account, along with our primary duty, which was always, remember, is to make the returns to pay the pensions of members, which but I think we'll cover this in much more detail in the workshops, it's fair to say, isn't it? So if we could note that, and that discussion there, it is important, it is a major part of what we'll be doing over the next few months, and then we'll come back to it in more detail when we can discuss this amongst ourselves at these workshops and come back with proposals here. So okay then, so can I ask Andrew to press on then? We are very short of time now.
I'm very conscious of time also, Chair, and I would just say the final comment that I'd draw out of this report, which I think is an important one, is perhaps skipping on to page 9, and it really is just to say that both LSIV and BlackRock are signatories to the UNPRI and UK Stewardship Code, the UN Principles of Responsible Investment, and the UK Stewardship Code. So that's a good positive alignment from a representation of what they're doing, and also you'll be able to see their submission to the Stewardship Code in due course as well. And there also are a range in the sort of final bullets of the culture tab. It shows that there are a range of contributions and collaborations initiatives which both organisations feed into, and therefore try and influence and engage with. And that goes from Asset Owner Diversity Charter, Climate Action 100 and Pension for Purpose on the LSIV side, across to TCFD and the UK Stewardship Disclosure Framework, for example, on the Carbon Disclosure Project. So a range of broad engagements that represent, a will to progress in this area that I think reflect on both organisations positively. So to me, this is it's a stock take for now. It's really useful information to have and to build on. It might inform elements of the Stewardship Code submission, but also it'll be a useful reference document to have whenever we sort of build on, let's say, aspirations with regard to things like voting, to understand the mechanics that are available via LSIV, and then perhaps take those forward. So that's probably, I'll leave it there if that's okay, Chair, on this one, and I'm happy to take any final remarks.
That's very helpful, and obviously we can consider as we go forward on to what extent it's appropriate to us to get involved in some of these organisations directly ourselves.
Chair,
sorry, Nick. Yeah.
Just picking up my original point about BlackRock, which was, can we monitor their behaviour, not just simply in terms of outcomes and commitments to principles, but what they're actually doing as part of the reporting process. And so going to your point about the workshops, it would be really helpful to have that sort of information at the workshop.
Yeah, that's a good point. I did notice that we have a less. The view that we're expressing in the quarterly update report on BlackRock is a bit less rosy than you might come to if you just look at the overall principle. I mean, a criticism of BlackRock is that they sort of talk a good talk, but don't always vote in line with what you'd expect. And I think that's reflected in your adequate rating of them in the later report.
Yeah, and I think just to address that specifically, I think firstly, sorry, I didn't catch you. That wasn't the committee who made the comment there. Apologies. But I think we do.
Councillor Sharman.
Councillor Sharman, thank you. We do explicitly comment within our quarterly report on BlackRock as both as a broad organisation and both from a responsible investment point of view, generally at organisational level. And in that report at the moment, it is as you rightly say, Chair, flagged as adequate. That perhaps was established a year or so ago, and is due for review. And as you say, they've made some positive progress with regard to. I guess our primary concern when the rating was established was with regard to their stewardship and evidencing of policies for voting decisions and so on and so forth. They've made some positive progress in some of that. We've still got some concerns in some other areas, but that rating is up for review in the not too distant future. And I know Simon's involved in that. But it is something, I think, just to address the specific question, it is something that we do monitor on a within our quarterly report and report back to the committee.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think just take the next point. I mean, you can actually see how they vote is on record, isn't it? And that's the primary evidence of whether they're good stewards or not, frankly, isn't it?
Exactly.
And we can, when we get into this, it'd be useful to see. Well, this is the whole part of our exercise, isn't it? To see how we can have more useful reports on how these people are exercising responsibilities on our behalf, isn't it? Okay, can we is anyone? Let's have a look in the. Yeah, okay, I don't see any more hands, so if we can move, we're going to thank again Hymans on that, and I think we're just on 5 and 6, just asked to note them, aren't they, the presentation and the report, so if we do that, noted, and then move on to item 7 and 8. Now, these are linked in some way. I was going to suggest actually we do item 8 first, because there are quite a lot of the explanations in item 8 that help understand item 7. Is that all right? Gemma, is that all right?
Oh, yeah, it's all right by me. I thought you were checking with everybody
Okay
else.
then. So if we can deal with item 8 then, yep, if we can push on then.
So, Chair, just before I start, Michael had mentioned in the preparation there was 20 minutes for this. I don't know that there is 20 minutes now. What was your kind of preference on time here?
Sorry?
What's your preference on time here?
Quick as possible, I'm afraid.
Right. Okay. So this agenda item is for information only.
I mean, you can assume that the members will have read the reports.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, this agenda item is for information only. We have prepared a short slide deck on some of the key points. Ian's going to share that for me because I was a bit worried that the technology was going to fail me. So Ian, if you can put the presentation up, I'm just going to start. Committee, at this point in the valuation cycle, it's quite usual that LGPS funds start to consider the outlook to the next triennial valuation, and this has probably been highlighted even more so in this cycle because there's been so much going on, and the paper that is in your pack is really to highlight some of the issues that have occurred since the last valuation that might have an impact on pensions funding. COVID is a huge one. Yeah, Ian, I can see the slides. Thanks very much. You could probably put it on slideshow, but it's up to you.
Yeah, we can see the slides, yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay, that's fine. Ian had sent me a little message just to check. And I'm also conscious that there's some new members of committee who'll probably want to hear a little bit more about that. So we'll talk a bit about funding strategy. We'll talk a little bit about some of the big things that we need to have an eye on as we move through to the valuation. And probably big caveat right now is I'm not going to give you any answers tonight. This is about context and where things are at. Chair, you really helpfully teed me up before you concluded that last item. When we get involved in so many technical big issues, it's quite easy to forget that actually the fund exists to pay the pensions to the members, and we need to be reminded of that, I think, from time to time. The pensions are paid by a combination of the fund's assets, the returns on the fund's assets, and employer contributions. And what I thought would be useful is just to have a quick reminder of the funding strategy as it was agreed in 2019. So we're on the right slide, Ian. Slide 4 is great. Thanks very much. It sounds quite easy, doesn't it? Contributions, investment returns, and that's it. But ultimately, the fund invests in risky assets. And so the returns are not known with certainty, but employers need certainty about what they're going to pay. So we're constantly trying to keep that balance right. And the valuation is the point in time where you set the balance between contributions, their affordability, their stability, and the reliance on future investment returns. It's a bit of a seesaw trying to get that in the right place. So the fund strategy at 2019, contributions were set at, in total, 18.7% of pay. And that was to cover the cost of new benefits, but it's known as the primary contribution rate. So you might hear that terminology from time to time. And then an additional, in total, around about 22 million. Now, in old money, this was called deficit recovery contributions, but the regulations now call that the secondary contribution or the secondary rate. And it's really defined as what you pay in addition to the primary contributions, which sounds a little confusing, I think. At this point in time, the fund held about 1.6 billion of assets, and the liabilities assessed at the valuation, they were assessed to be about 1.7 billion. And again, just a quick pause and a reminder here. The liabilities is the amount the fund wants to hold, such that together with the pre-banked investment return, or the terminology that I personally loathe, which is discount rate, that there's enough to pay the benefits. So at 2019, this pre-banked return was set at 3.85%. And what we did when that a discount rate or investment return was set was we looked at the fund's assets and modelled to see, actually, we know there's risk in these returns. We know there's risk in the return that we're pre-banking within the liability calculation. Can we quantify that? Can we understand just how likely it is that the fund's assets will indeed return 3.85% every single year for the foreseeable future? So I hope that was just a very, very quick overview of the funding strategy. If anybody has any questions,
that's great.
I'm happy to take them, but we can move on.
That's
So-
everything. Sorry, I interrupted. Apologies.
No, on you go.
I thought you'd finished. Apologies. Yeah, I was just saying that represents everything the Pensions Fund Committee does in one slide, I think. So as best you could possibly do it.
Right.
Is that any? Everyone's looking stunned in the room. Has anyone got a question or comment on that? No. Okay, you want to press on?
Yes, I will do. Now, Ian, I'm going to skip over slide 5 in the interest of time. Slide 5 only talks about the fact that different employers have slight different tweaks to how we set their funding strategy, but we don't need to cover that tonight in the interest of time. Instead, we'll start to look at some of the big things that we need to have a little eye on for 2022. So COVID-19, we need to think about this in terms of the impact on asset performance and what's happened in the assets between 2019 and 2022, because we pre-bank returns, so we need to see how well the funds stacked up against that pre-banked return. And we also need to look at the longer term economic outlook, as that might impact what we can pre-bank going forward. So at the last valuation, we said 3.85%. That will be returned in 72 out of 100 outcomes. We'll need to consider that again, because when there is market uncertainty and the allowance and the discount can change. The other thing we need to look at, of course, is what has been the impact on mortality experience. So I'm just going to talk about those things quite quickly. COVID-19, the picture on the slide is just the progression of a kind of average LGPS fund since 2019 to about just now. What I've tried to do is pick out some kind of key events that happened in the course of the pandemic, news headlines, so that you can see just where particular points of volatility occurred. And it probably explains actually some of the reasons why there were these particular points of volatility. I think probably the key one to pick out is really at the bottom there. Last March. Now, if we'd looked at the fund's funding position last March, your funding position would have been about 76%, which is quite a difference to the 92 that was the funding outcome in the 2019 valuation. But actually, if we roll forward today, I don't think anybody last March would have guessed how well assets would have returned in the last year. The average LGPS return in the last year is about 25%, which when you compare that with the 3.85% that has been pre-banked in the calculations, actually funding levels have at least improved back to where they were in 2019, and in your instance actually improved further than that. So we need to be mindful of that. You know, we're going into this valuation with a real positive tailwind on the funding plan, but equally we can't be too excited about that. I mean, actuaries don't get excited about too many things, but anyway, we're maybe a little bit animated this evening. That is a great news story, but we need to be cognizant of what might come next and not get too ahead of ourselves. Similarly, on mortality, there have been excess deaths. That's just a fact. What we don't know is how many of those excess deaths have occurred within pension scheme members, and I'm fairly sure COVID was not selective on that basis. So I do believe we will see excess deaths over what we would have imagined would have happened in the 3-year period, but we'll need to have a look to see with what does that mean now. So Andrew, just moving on to the next slide on longevity, we'll need to look at two things. We'll need to think about what happens next on longevity, and this could go two ways. Future longevity might reduce. So what we might see is a global recession, and that have an economic impact, and then the impact of poor economic outcomes on individuals. New virus strains emerging. I think when this slide was first designed, we thought that was a bit hypothetical. It's not now. You know, there's so many different things each week with the Greek letters being associated to them now. And then there's also the piece of what will any potential delays in treatment in the NHS on those who haven't been impacted by COVID but actually should have been treated for other conditions more quickly. Will we see that have an effect over the medium term? Loads to think about. Equally, it could go the other way. Some particular things that kind of caught my interest, changes in social behaviour. You know, will we just all be a bit more hygienic, and that might make a difference going forward? Who knows? Anyway, as I say, kind of lots to think about, and just to summarise on slide 9, we'll need to think about all of these things as we look into the valuation. Now, slide 10, Andrew, does talk about some of the regulatory changes that have occurred since the valuation. I'm not going to speak about them now because we will cover this in detail, but regulatory changes are some of the things that we'll need to have an eye on as we move into the valuation. Now, in the paper, we speak about a whole load of other things. We speak about 95k cap, climate change. I don't think we need to speak about climate change anymore tonight. I think it was either Andrew or Ian mentioned that is something that we will need to be mindful of and consider as we set funding plans, because whilst you can look at the ESG and carbon impact on your assets, thinking about that in conjunction with the liabilities and employer covenant, we need to put all of that together to make sure that we are making informed decisions relating to that risk where possible. Okay, let's think then. The other thing that I mentioned we would in the paper that we would talk about was GAD's Section 13 report. I don't have a slide on GAD's Section 13 reports. I don't have all that much to say, but I can provide a verbal update. What happens after a triennial valuation is that your results are submitted to the Government Actuaries Department, and you will then hear me and others refer to that as GAD, but we'll try to avoid the acronyms, or at least introduce them. And what the Government Actuary does is they were appointed by MHCLG when the new scheme came into play in 2014, and their job is to check everybody's funding plans to make sure that nobody is setting an inappropriate funding plan. Now, with the steps that you go through in your decision making, it would be flawed if we were getting to this point and you were being told your funding plan was inappropriate. But we submit these metrics and information to GAD, they do their analysis, and what we have back at the moment is just draft results of when we look at the Hackney Pension Fund relative to all of the other pension funds, how does your plan stack up? They do some very sort of crude analysis and analytics and metrics on various things, and they rank them, they colour code them red, amber and green. For the vast majority of all of your metrics, they are green, as I say, as I would expect. There's one metric that is amber for your fund. That is nothing to be alarmed about, but it's better that you know before the report is published. It's also not a surprise to us that you've got one amber on your report. The Government Actuary is flagging funds as amber if their contributions came down at the last valuation, and at the same time, the deficit recovery period stayed the same, okay? And I think if you ask different commentators, they will give different opinions on whether that's an appropriate measure or not, but it is one that they are looking at, so it's important from that point of view. But in terms of the appropriateness of your funding plan, I don't think there's anything to be concerned about, but it is obviously appropriate that you know about it in advance. Outlook for GAD's Section 13 report is that they had anticipated that this would be published before the summer, but the latest indications suggest that it will be maybe September, October time, because they're still engaging with funds. You know, I'm telling you good news again. Absolutely everything green apart from this one metric, but not all the funds are like that. So they do want to engage with funds so they can properly understand the funding plans and the outcomes of their analysis before they publish a report that labels somebody as red, amber or green, because quite often there might be something in the analysis that can be explained when more information is provided over and above sort of kind of static figures. So with that in mind, I'm just going to check to see if there's anything else that it would be appropriate to draw out on this report. I think probably we can pause here, Chair. You know, if we are comfortable with the sort of key issues that I've brought out, but I might bring it back to just what to expect next in relation to the planning through to the valuation, which we're engaging with officers on. So if you want to move, Andrew, just the last slide, I think, or Ian, sorry. Last slide. What are the things that the fund are considering right now? My own view is there's loads that can be done before evaluation date. You don't need to wait till the 31st of March to start thinking about evaluation. Some really key things: individual member data cleansing. As I understand it, there were some data challenges at 2019. The intention is that there is a data cleansing exercise in the autumn so that the valuation can run more smoothly. If that data cleansing does run more smoothly, then the data can be used to help inform and give advance warning to, in particular, the council on the likely outcome for their contribution rate. That would be a really aspirational outcome. But it's good to have a really positive goal. So if the data is usable, then we will try to carry out some analysis to be able to set the scene on the outlook for rates and for budget for the council as early as we possibly can in the valuation year. The climate risk modelling has been mentioned already, and with that, I'm happy to take any more questions. I do appreciate I've gone at pace, but hopefully it's been a useful overview for you.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. Ben.
Gemma, that was a fantastic report, and I think new members would have found that very helpful for a wonderful overview. I just note that we're currently, and I know not to get too excited, 102% funding level, which I think certainly for the first time in the last 4 years, and maybe much longer, is the first time we've ever reached that. If there wanted to be a decision to reduce, and I'm not advocating this, the 21.9 million the council gives to the, or thereabouts, gives to the pension fund every year, could that be done mid-cycle or not?
Not mid-cycle, Ben, no. There are now in these employer flexibilities ways in which you can adjust rates at a non-triennial point, but asset returns is not one of the reasons, unfortunately. So yeah, not at this point in time. The flexibilities really exist for maybe, you know, employers who are really worried about the covenant, and perhaps you want to do something about that kind of a situation.
So, Michael.
Yeah, this committee showed great astuteness and prescience in spreading the fund more internationally, and there's definite benefits from our astuteness then. But to be frank, the tiger companies in Brazil and India are under huge amount of strain because of COVID, and in the United Kingdom, as we know, the retail and commercial property sector, there's a bloodbath. Don't go to Debenhams for your luggage, you won't find them open. So, although I'm delighted by these figures, do they take account of these facts, or is this just a particular point in time, and are we likely to see significant fluctuations in the next, say, 6 months?
If I take Jonathan as well, and then we can answer all three together. So, Jonathan.
I guess That report was very interesting. I cannot find it in my documents.
Yeah.
So I'd appreciate if it could be made available to the committee members.
It's item 8.
I was going to say that as well. Yeah.
Good point. And Chair, we have it in colour too.
Yes.
I found it very difficult to read this report. A lot of it was meant to be colour. It's just shades of grey. And I think we deserve a proper presentation.
Yeah, I'll come back to that a bit. Jackie, sorry.
Yeah, can I ask Gemma to clarify in relation to the 102%? So that takes the sort of asset values as they are now, but in terms of liabilities, what do those liabilities relate to? So,
it does take an updated liability value as at March 2021 as well, Jackie. And we have made some adjustment for some kind of reduction in the kind of optimism for the outlook for markets as well. I think we've got to be, I suppose I don't want to get too drawn into numbers when I've not got them in front of me. I wouldn't want to confuse people, but we were 92% funded, there's been a 25% return, but we're at 102% funding. There has been an offset in terms of there's been an increased value placed on the liabilities. I think probably that maths is okay for everybody to get their head around in terms of the relativity. So yes, the liabilities are valued higher, all else being equal to.
Okay. Ben, did you want to come back? Your hand's up.
No, sorry, forgot to take down.
Okay, then. So, Gemma, if you want to answer cover the points that were raised in the questions there. If you can.
So the previous question actually related to asset returns. So Andrew might want to comment on that, but I think I can probably refer back to my non-investment consultant comment from earlier, which was, I don't think anybody would have thought on the 31st of March that there was any chance of a 25% return in the next 12 months. So I guess we don't really know what will happen in the next 12. Andrew, do you want to add to that in a more sophisticated fashion?
Yeah, I'm just getting myself off mute. I think that's fair. That's spot on, Gemma, to a degree, in the sense that there's a high degree of uncertainty within markets. I think there's lots of positive views with regard to the growth outlook for a lot of asset classes, such as equities. I think there's lots of positive views in terms of news stories around the, let's say, default risks or credit risks within some of the fixed income attributes. So, however, I do believe there's lots of sort of downside and uncertainty risk within the future outlook as well, and that I think is largely reflected in, you know, the path of COVID is very uncertain, and the impact that might have is probably one of the biggest sources of uncertainty that exists within markets at this point in time.
Okay, Gemma.
I think that's all the questions answered, but I'm happy to take any follow-up if there are any.
Are people happy with those answers then?
Can I just say?
Oh yeah, Cam, sorry.
Yes, just on the triennial evaluation outcome, one of according to the information I read here, is very sensitive to the membership data.
Yeah.
So what is the update on the membership data cleansing?
Well, that's the piece that's going to be carried out in the autumn, is my understanding. One of the kind of sensible times to do membership data cleansing is once the annual benefit statements have gone out in August, because the data all has to come in from all of the employers. It's got to be cleansed in order to provide the benefit statements to members in the first place. I am not close enough to the details of what's been going on within your admin plans on data, but I do think that from the last call that I was on with all of the employers and the administrators, they were talking positively about the plans and things that they put in place in order to improve the data quality, and even just that interface between the employer and the administrator to gather the data in the first place. But perhaps that's something that Michael or can provide an update at in September, although I wouldn't want to be giving him work to do since he's not on the call, I think. But that might be the way to take that forward, to give an update once the EBS statements are out.
Okay. So if there are no more questions there, can I?
Just a final presentation, but I would like our advisors to move from 12-point presentations, not in 10 or even 9-point some of this. They need a good third extra on their type size, in my view, for us elderly folk to find this very dense prose hard to read.
Sponsored by Specsavers.
We're going to invest in Specsavers. Can our advisors note that?
Yes, Chair, that's fine. Apologies. This is my first time at this committee and I wasn't sure how things would be shared with the technology and with the packs and things. So I thought I had covered all bases, but point size wasn't one of them. So yeah, noted.
I hope you're not implying that the eyesight of this committee is a lot worse than
If it makes you feel any better, on occasion on this call this evening, I found myself pull my ears closer to the screen as though that'll help me hear better, like I'm in the room. So I don't think, I think hearing and eyesight maybe need some checks.
I think we're all struggling with this brave new world of technology, but it's a point to note on presentations. And it is very helpful to have these things in advance because some members will read them and it does aid understanding. And if you could circulate the latest set of slides, that would be really helpful, yeah?
Yeah, I think officers have it, so they can send it out.
Yeah, and can I apologise for the lack of colour print on the agendas? We did specify colour, didn't we?
Yes,
but that's not what arrived. So apologies, and we'll take that up with the printers. Okay then. So that's item 8. Yes, if we can note that paper. Yeah, and then item 7.
So item 7 is a paper in the standard council formats, Chair. Yep. It's not a Hyman's paper.
Okay, well, who is it? Right, okay.
So
who's going to do item 7 then?
It is me as well, but I didn't think it needed additional resource to sit alongside, which is probably helpful in the interests of time as well.
That's why that's why I did item 8 first, because it largely explains what's in item 7. Except for the issue of exit, someone could say what an exit credit is. Just so we're absolutely clear.
Yeah, I'll cover that when we get to that point.
Go on then. So who's dealing with this?
I think it's just me. I don't know if anybody's
go on,
doing
okay then, Gemma.
I think Michael maybe would have been if he'd been feeling
Gemma.
Yeah.
Okay. You don't mind, yeah.
No, absolutely fine. So the point of this paper is to bring to committee some draft changes to the funding strategy statement and also outline that there are some further changes to come to the funding strategy statement. For new members, the funding strategy statement is the funding rulebook. So like the investment strategy sets out where you'll invest, this sets out how we'll set contributions, which was the point of the last presentation and helpfully reordered by the chair. There have been various consultations since the previous formal valuation that relate to various themes on funding. We have the outcomes on 3 of these consultations and they are noted in 6.1 of the paper. So we have outcomes relating to point B, point C and point D in 6.1. So the exit credits consultation, flexibility around cessation debts and proposals for policy changes for payments of employer exit credits. 2 of these are called employer flexibilities and we kind of talk about them in tandem. They are the points that require some further work in order to suggest the funding strategy statement updates, and so we will come back to them in September. Quite a lot of detail in that. We need it not to be complex for employers, so it needs a little bit more time. Exit credits, though, we have got the draft changes to the funding strategy within this paper, and that's what we'll be seeking to get approval for the changes this evening. So yes, by way of reminder, what even is an exit credit? Take a little step back. A cessation valuation occurs when an employer leaves the fund. An employer will leave the fund if they are an admitted body and they have got to the end of their contract, or they are an admitted body who has closed to new entrants, is no longer offering the LGPS, and by natural evolution has no active members left and they leave. Previously in the regulations, when this cessation was carried out, if there was a deficit, the employer was asked to make a contribution to make it good so that they could walk away. However, if there was a surplus, they did not get that back. So there was some asymmetric risk as described, because they had to pay a deficit, but they didn't get back a positive outcome. And so there was a consultation and then changes to the regulations to allow exit credits to be paid back to employers if at the point the cessation valuation is carried out and the employer is in surplus and other criteria exist. So the regulations now say that an exit credit can be paid to take into account, but the fund has to take into account the extent to which the assets are greater than the liabilities, i.e. there is a surplus, the proportion that surplus relates to employer contributions, and that's to really make sure there is some fairness in this. Any representations made by the letting authority or the contractor, and then sort of loose point that says, and anything else of relevance. So the funding strategy statement policy proposals are noted in the paper, and that probably takes us down to around about 7.3.5, which is where we've kind of set out a summarised version of the proposed approach that will be taken when considering if an exit credit should be paid to an employer at the point of cessation. So in summary, it says a case-by-case approach will be taken. It also says that we will limit the exit credit to the maximum that an employer has paid in contributions. This is a sensible thing to do, because the reality is that we showed that picture of funding earlier, right? Funding goes all over the place. And if a contract is let at a particular sweet spot and then employer leaves another particular sweet spot, even if they've had a small membership, they could have a very, very healthy exit credit that far outweighs any contribution that they ever made to the fund. So that is intended to kind of safeguard that those excess returns stay in the fund to help pay for member benefits. And then the further point that's in this policy is that it's been proposed that an exit credit will only be paid if the admission agreement began after the point at which these regulations changed, inferring that if anybody joined the fund prior to 14th of May 2018 under the old rules, where they knew they would pay a cessation but not get a surplus back, then that will continue. So this is really for cessations from the 14th of May 2018 onwards, and any exit surpluses that exist at the time. I think there's a question, Chair.
Yeah, I was just waiting for you to finish, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, now it's fine. I can
Ben.
move on. Yeah.
Thank you, Gemma.
Thanks for explaining that. So I suppose the worst case scenario would be a massive employer leaves at the point where they're at a sweet spot, and then the fund goes dramatically down just afterwards. Just hypothetically, worst case scenario. Are we able to spread out the exit fee on condition that it remains above surplus over a period of time, like 12 months, 3 years, or something like that, to further mitigate risk?
No, not really. And the other difficulty in all of that is that there would be a kind of governance issue. The limitation here really is that you're limiting it to being no more than they ever paid in, and then the fund will get to keep anything extra. Take the example, joined the fund a year ago, 1 million of assets allocated to an employer. Come this March, that's £250,000 more. But they've maybe had a really small payroll and only paid in about £10,000 in contributions in the last year. It would be nonsensical if they got £250,000 back and not just what they've paid in the last year. Because the reality is, if an employer like that, probably quite a small one, had gone the other way, would they have been able to make the £250,000 deficit contribution? Or would that have created an insolvency event? Potentially would have. So it's to try and smooth that out as best possible.
Okay, are there any other questions or comments on that? Gemma, is there anything else you want to add?
There's one other point. The final bullet in section 7.3.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Good. Yeah. Yes.
So the final point in section 7.3 was intended to kind of future-proof this policy, just in case there ever is the situation where an employer comes to the fund and says, we would like to join the fund. We've got an arrangement with the letting authority that all pension risk is going to be kept with the letting authority and not passed to us. That's kind of commonly known as a pass-through agreement. So we've put this in here just so it's there should the need for that ever arise. However, there was a High Court ruling last week in which a situation like this was challenged, and so the wording that we have proposed within the paper will need the word normally or usually added to the wording. So but we only really got this news on Friday. So the wording for that covers that final bullet will need the word usually added to it. I think at the moment says we will not pay in a pass-through. We need to say we will usually not pay in a pass-through. It's subtle, so hopefully you can agree that one verbally. The employer flexibilities piece is coming back in September with the detail. Okay. There is a lot of detail. It will be in an appendix to the funding strategy statement. And then there's only one other amend to flag. We would probably not have updated for this, but when we were updating it anyway, we thought it was an advantageous point to throw in, and that's just to note the outcome of the Goodwin case. In the interest of time, don't need to go into what the Goodwin case is, but we can follow up with that if it's of use. Again,
Could we just have 1 minute on what the issue in the Goodwin case, which is basically about sex discrimination, well, discrimination against partners of male partners and yeah, go on, you do it.
Yeah, so it's quite a small issue in terms of the impact it will have on funding, but it's another one like the McLeod case. A court case was raised in relation to the teachers scheme, the outcome of which is expected to apply across all of the public sector pension schemes, although again, the final remediation is not agreed as yet. And it came about because a less favourable pension is payable to a cohort of members. That cohort of members, unusually being sexually discriminated against, was surviving male partners of a female member. Okay? So they were worse off that compared with surviving male partners of a male member or surviving female partners of a male member. Okay, so hopefully not too confusing. Really small group of people.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions or comments on this report? Okay, can we then well, I think it's agree the exit credits and note the other two positions, isn't it? Yeah, that's appropriate. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Chair.
Now, that brings us on to the quarterly update report, item 9. I hope members have had a chance to sort of go through this. I wasn't going to ask for an introduction, but if there are any questions or comments on it. Obviously, the thing to note, really, the big thing at is the point we just discussed about the increase in our funding level to 102%, which is fantastic news. But obviously, you know, we're experiencing extreme volatility at the moment. So, it was, as we said, it was 72% a year ago, and that's just, and it just reliant on stock markets staying where they are at the moment, isn't it? But it's something to say. We're going to come back to, because that will, if sustained, that will have impacts for our investment strategy, won't it, in terms of de-risking. And I understand we'll come back to consider that in September. Take it like what the position is then. Whether we need to adjust our strategy because of that. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So, are there any questions or comments on the update report?
No, Rob, can you just explain what you mean by de-risking?
De-risking. That's a good one. Andrew, would you like to do that rather than me get it wrong?
So I'll build on what Gemma said, and essentially there are two things which will get the fund from where it is now to where it needs to be, and that's fully funded on a very long-term basis, and that's contributions and investment. So those two go hand in hand. In theory, if you get way ahead of track, you may be able to reduce the risk on your investment strategy, i.e. target a lower return and invest in lower risk assets. But you can kind of only do that if you're confident the contributions are going to continue as they are into the foreseeable future. So de-risking would be almost thinking about, well, let's say if the funding gets way ahead of schedule, is there a possibility to reduce the investment risk but not impact the long-term potential success of the funding journey that we're on?
But there are some certain trigger points we've set, aren't there, where we will consider those?
There were previous trigger points in place, Chair, but those have been superseded by the strategy work which was done. There was, whenever we did the strategy review, we looked at the scenario of if we were 10% ahead of schedule, and then looked at sort of different considerations when it comes to contributions. And essentially, at that point in January, it was decided that there's no burning platform to consider de-risking, given the analysis that was carried out. Nonetheless, essentially what we're going to do in September is just test that again and really think about, well, what if we really do get a long way ahead of schedule? So to my mind, no burning platform, but sensible to have a plan.
Andrew,
Sorry,
I think the helpful thing to add on to that is actually, what do these really good returns give us? They give us choices, potentially to consider. There is no such thing as a free lunch. You can't have everything. And we have to get that balance between reliance on growth in the assets and risk, more or less, and contributions. What is a palatable cost of providing these benefits? Because you don't get both. But it's a good place to be. It's a nice place to be.
Okay then, so we'll consider this again in September. Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair. I do have a question about the GMP reconciliation effort, and I'm referring to page 10 of 10 on 130. It talks about 380 members are being reviewed as a separate exercise. Can I unpack that figure a bit and find out a bit more? I'm assuming we're talking about scheme members here. 380, that sounds like quite a few, although I'm obviously aware that there are several tens of thousands of people involved in the scheme. Are these pensioners? Are they deferreds? Are they actives? What are they?
I don't know who's best to answer that. Karen, maybe?
Yes, thank you, Chair. They are pensioners and dependents, Jonathan. So benefits already in payment. If you need any further detail, I'll need to come back to you on that, but I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions or comments on it? Okay, can we note that report then? We're due to have another break now. I don't know if you want to or want to push on. Let's carry. You're happy to do that?
Yeah, press on.
Yeah, okay. So item 10, regulatory update report, which is for information, isn't it? I don't know if Karen wants to just very briefly draw our attention to the more important points in it.
Absolutely, Chair. Thank you. So keeping it extremely brief and assuming everyone has read it. No bother at all. No bother. Assuming everyone has read it. Just going through the 4 areas individually. and the impact on Hackney Pension Fund is probably what I want to draw out. The TPR's new code, you're currently mainly compliant with the existing code, and therefore that will put you in a really positive position when the new code comes out. But there are a few areas where we're probably already doing some work, such as in relation to cyber resilience, and also there might be some greater requirements such as documenting your IT processes and procedures. So there will be a bit of work in evidencing compliance there. The Good Governance Review project, it started out originally being a project about separation between the pension fund and the host authorities. It's now ended up with just a range of recommendations about good governance. So actually, again, you're already compliant with a lot of these around areas such as conflicts of interest and knowledge, but there is going to be quite a lot of focus on knowledge and skills coming out, so you might need to think a bit about that. And also one of the key recommendations is that there should be a senior LGPS officer, so one individual ultimately responsible for the fund. So we need to work out who's that's going to be, probably towards Jackie, but that's a further discussion. So a bit of work to be done there when that comes out, but we are waiting for MHCLG statutory guidance first. On the McLeod written ministerial statement, so this is just confirming, or initially confirming at a high level, the outcome of the consultation on the McLeod remedy last year and how it's going to impact the LGPS. There's no surprises in there other than the regulations aren't going to come out until 2023, which is later than what we originally expected. However, putting that aside, everything in there is basically providing us assurance on what we're doing as part of the programme already, and therefore it's a case of carry on as we're doing. There's definitely no change in approach. We'll get a detailed consultation response later on this year, so we can think about that. So that's a big sort of tick that everything we're doing is good. And the final point on the SITFA Knowledge and Skills Code and Framework, it's not out yet, it is imminent, and really realistically we're probably going to have to look at your knowledge and skills policy for the fund again when it does come out, a bit of strengthening there around what the knowledge and skills requirements are, how they're delivered and how they're monitored, particularly at committee level going forward. So that's really the key impact of all those sort of regulatory changes on the pension fund, and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, and the McLeod judgment is a age discrimination case, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Is some members were protected? Yeah, that's right. Albeit I'm sure that there's probably indirect sex discrimination in there as well.
Cool. Indeed, yeah. I won't get that.
Yeah.
Jonathan. Thank you, Chair. It's a question, section 8.2, the third bullet point, representation. This is on page 155. Representation, including, this is the Scheme Advisory Board, Good Governance Review. Representation, including the requirement to produce and publish a policy on the representation of scheme members, explaining its approach to voting rights for each party. I'm the appointed scheme member representative. Am I going to have any input into this policy?
If I may, Chair, I'll answer that.
Yep,
and it's probably quite a straightforward answer, is we don't yet know what the requirements are going to be, because these are still recommendations. So until MHCLG come out with their statutory guidance. But my gut reaction is probably we've already got something within Hackney Council's constitution that clarifies who is on the committee and whether or not they have voting rights. So it could just be expanding that to clarify the reasons for those decisions. But it is really a bit of a wait and see at the moment, Jonathan, because we don't quite know.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments on the report? Oh, Michael.
Yeah, that was very interesting. Who is ultimately responsible for compliance? Is it us as a committee, or is it officers, or is it the chief executive? Who ultimately, you know, corrupts up with?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. If I may, Chair, I'll answer that one too.
Yes, sorry.
So Councillor Desmond, at this point in time, the Constitution is putting these requirements, I would say not explicitly, but definitely generally within the committee's terms of reference to the Pension Committee. So it is very much the Pension Committee's responsibility. It is quite interesting that actually the Pension Board have a legal responsibility to assist the administering authority with ensuring compliance with things like regulations, but also it calls out specifically the pension regulators requirements. So you would expect the Pension Board to be asking questions and watching what you're doing about this. But really with all of these things, a lot of it will be about developing compliance statements that are then brought to the committee, or policies that are brought to the committee for approval. Does that answer your question, Councillor Desmond?
Yep, it's us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions?
It's you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? I can't see. Okay then, so what have we got to do on this? Is to just to note it, yeah?
As Chair, yeah.
Thank you very much, Karen. We'll note the report.
Thank you.
So then item 11, then fund administration policy updates. There's a whole raft there. Jackie's going to deal with this, I think.
Yes, so this report is for approval, and it's basically in relation to 3 policies which were up for review. One of them being the communicated educations policy, another being the voluntary scheme pays policy, and the final one being the administrative authorities discretions policy. So in terms of the communications policy, there's been minor changes to that proposed changes as highlighted in the appendix. Basically, it's just around different references to the pension regulations new code, which is up and coming either later this year or beginning of next year, and also it refers to the employer self-service portal, etc., and the changes that's going to bring about in the way we communicate with our members. The second policy, the voluntary schemes pays policy, that is the policy in relation to where members have breached their annual allowance, and they want the scheme to pay for the amount which the tax charge which is due, and this is for circumstances where there's not a mandatory.
Sorry, can we hear? No, we can't really hear. I think the people online can hear because the mic system works online, but not in the chamber.
So the communication strategy is just very minor changes to the strategy, basically relating to the pension regulations new code, which is due to come into force at the end of this year, beginning of next, and also some changes in relation to the employer's self-service portal, which is due to come in the next year. So the second one is in relation to voluntary scheme pay. So that's the policy which deals with where members have got a tax charge due to the fact that they've breached their annual allowance, and where there's not mandatory allowance for them to say scheme pay. So effectively, it's where we can have a policy around when we want the scheme to pay, when we don't want the scheme to pay. And the only amendments in that is in relation to the statutory income limit where a taper applies. So if you earn over a certain amount, then your allowance goes down, and effectively what we're just doing is updating those allowances in the policy. The third one is the administrative authorities' discretions. Again, this is very much a sort of a bookkeeping exercise where we've taken out a couple of policies where they're no longer relevant, and we've included a discretion in relation to the exit credit, which we mentioned earlier in the committee meeting. So those policies are up for approval.
Okay, thank you. Well, any questions or comments? Did we get that? Not really. Okay, I think there's some very minor changes in most of this, bringing that up to date. And I think just the points I would make in noting the communication strategy changes, just to say something I think we need to come back and revisit, particularly if you remember in light of the conversation we had earlier about the importance of ascertaining the views of our members, and as part of, I think, the discussions we're having on responsible investment, we could pick up how we communicate with our members on those issues and allow people to express opinions and things like that. Is that all right? And then there are other technical changes in the other 2 policies, which are again pretty minor. Well, I mean, I presume you had the opportunity to go through it. Are there any other questions or comments on that particular? Are we happy to approve those? Thank you very much. Training options. Now, there was going to be a paper. Unfortunately, it's not been possible for a number of reasons to produce that today. I don't know if we could say how we're going to take that one forward then.
Yes, I think as we've discussed previously, we're going to send out a paper which gives some options for training. So we want to put out questionnaires to see what members' preferences are in relation to online training, virtual training sessions, and various other sort of timetabled sessions. And we'll get your feedback, and then we'll timetable it in over the next few months, particularly for new members.
Okay, so as Michael promised in his email, and I sent it around, basically I forwarded it again with a welcome from me the other day. We're going to, as has been referred to earlier, there's a whole set of protocols on the SIPFA training protocol thing, which actually Nick will be familiar with because a similar thing applies in audit, isn't it? And we'll be applying that. I'm also seeking people's views on how best to deliver some training, you know. And I think we're also offering you opportunity to meetings and discussions with myself and Jackie and Michael, I guess it will be, about you know, issues of pensions, because obviously there are a lot of particularly for new members, there are a lot of quite complicated things to get your head, not a lot, but there are a number of issues you really get to get your head around. But basically, we'll be circulating people to get their views on how best to do this. Sorry, Ian's going to come in.
Build on that. That's okay, Chair. So yes, apologies that we haven't got the paper around for tonight's meeting, but what we can offer to do, similar to what we've done with colleagues on Audit Committee and Scrutiny, is offer to do like a virtual, just a drop-in stroke catch-up session once we've got the paper round, and if there's bits that people want to clarify or discuss with us, we're happy to run us all just a virtual drop-in for committee members to make sure we've got it right. Because really what I'm very keen to make sure we do is come up with a blended training offer that sort of genuinely works for you and you've got input into, as opposed to just what maybe has happened in the past sometimes where it's been just show and tell presentations or events in the city. We're really keen to make sure we get it right, particularly given we've got a range of new members, which we're delighted at, to be on this committee, but we really want to get it right, and it might be easier to have that opportunity to talk it through with you as well, if that's okay, Chair.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I'm open to comments or points from members, if there are any at this stage.
Chair, I was just...
Ben, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, just say, I mean, one thing, just dovetailing on what we spoke about before. I mean, I think I would find it very useful to have a session on the sort of the benefits of passive versus active and the exclusion elements, and then also dovetailing and then following on from that, sort of the questions we're often getting asked about members of this committee about, well, why are you investing in X company and how easy, and their responsibilities around that, and the financial obligations, and how to answer those. What are our obligations? How we properly answer those questions. So all around those questions that we're getting a lot of emails about and getting asked a lot.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, is that, I mean, Dave's got any comments? I mean, I think yes is the answer to that, and secondly, it will be absolutely, you know, definitely integral to what we're going to be doing in our responsible investment review as well. Yeah, is that all right then? So if there are no further comments or questions on that, we'll pick it. Yeah, obviously we'll circulate information separately and we'll pick it up. And just one thing to say, in my email to members, I obviously don't have my email address, but I put my mobile phone number down. Yeah, it's not subject for the public presentation, but any of the members of the committee or collective, by the way, are very welcome to get in contact with me. You know. And I'm very happy to have a discussion and help facilitate discussion with the officers as well. Well, obviously you're very welcome to ring Jackie and Michael as well. You know, but it's important we get as much communication on some of these issues as possible. Unfortunately, our committees tend to be quite long and crowded agendas. It's a rather hangover from the day when we used to have, I don't know how many we used to have, about 8 or 10 committees, didn't we, a year? And the council took a decision to cut these down to, and really the workload did not decrease.
It's increased.
So we keep struggling. We're trying to work out protocols to manage it more effectively. We'll continue to try to do that, I promise. Okay then, can we then, well, there's no item there, but just note the comments of the officers and myself there on that, if that's all right. Okay, if I could, if we could agree to exclude the press and the public. Yeah, as according to the resolution set out there.
Yeah.
Yep. Item 13.